Welcome to the Future of Demonstration, Season 1, Episode 1, Ground Truth, the al-Araqib Museum of Struggle. Look, if your data is based on assumption, subject to opinion, or up for discussion, then by definition, that is not ground truth. Do not theorize before that data has been observed and objectively measured. Listen. In remote sensing, ground truth refers to information collected on location, on site. Ground truth allows image data to be related to real features and materials on the ground. Take this example. Ground truth may refer to a process in which a pixel on a satellite image is compared to what there is in reality at the present time in order to verify the contents of this one pixel in the satellite image. So your ability to solve a problem using data science relies heavily on whether or not you can establish ground truth. Data that can be measured objectively. See, this is what the NASA's glossary says. Ground truth. Geophysical parameter data measured or collected by other means than the instrument itself, used as a correlative or calibration data for that instrument data. Ground truth data are another measurement of the phenomenon of interest. They are not necessarily more true than the instrument data. So the overarching ground truth is that no expert, human or machine, can identify all relevant information in all data at all times. Distilling knowledge effortlessly from data calls for a collaborative, human and remote sensing engagement. Or, in Denis Diderot's words, what has not been examined impartially has not been well examined. Skepticism is therefore the first step towards truth. Ground truth?
In thinking through the agency and potentiality of the title of this engagement for Morgan, as much as we can understand it, has been a long conversation undertaken with Sylvia and Max and Gerald. In fact, with Gerald, through forensic architecture, almost 5 years of working together in London. We were thinking which one of forensic architecture investigations would be appropriate to talk to you, to expose here together. And we were thinking to start with a certain paradox. In forensic architecture, which is now, as some of you might know, an agency that is run by architects, filmmakers, some computer coders, scientists, lawyers, and of course artists, we're engaging in incident analysis. We're looking at various situations, usually human rights violations, usually violence of state against civilians, but also not only is it a violence of state against civilians, it is an attempt by civil society groups to ask again, to take this agency to ourselves, to take the means of production, the means of evidence production, and produce our narrative, produced evidence together. One of the biggest problems that we have in forensic architecture is that often we start with a micro incident, with a shooting incident, with an assassination, a political assassination, a bombing campaign somewhere in the world. We try to unpack what is happening there. So we're looking at the split second of an incident. And the question we often ask ourselves, also as political activists, is how to connect that moment, that split second, to the long duration of politics and history. And I think that the case that we want to unpack here today, the case of al-Araqib, is both forensic architecture's investigation that really is the longest, in a sense that we are, for the past 4 years, engaged with Aziz Aturi, and you would meet him, you would hear from him in a second, and the village of al-Araqib and the community there, in undertaking an investigation of violence on its multiple scales, both the eruptive incidents of attacks, of eviction, and this is one of perhaps the first big eviction of that village. You'd hear more about al-Araqib by thousands of Israeli policemen that has raided it and destroyed it here in 2010 for the first time. Aziz now told me that the 120th act of demolition has just happened a few days ago. So that village has been destroyed 120 times and rebuilt 121 times. Those acts of destruction, erasure, in fact, of the village. This is an image from another place, but you would see how the Israeli state removed those Bedouin villages from the threshold of the desert. In fact, what you see here are the traces on the ground of a day's work of a bulldozer. Back and forth, reverse and forward, creating that scar on the landscape where a community has been before. How to connect those moments of eruption to the small scale, to the long scale, incremental, slow violence of desertification and territorial transformation is really something that we would like to discuss here today. In fact, all those places that you would see, all those acts of demolitions that I have shown, happen along a historically very particular area. When you think about Israel-Palestine, and of course, this is the area that we talk about today, you think about borders and frontiers, you think about fences and checkpoints, but perhaps the most violent frontier that goes throughout the area that we call the Middle East is one that has no fences at all, one that has no built fabric at all, but actually a path of demolition. It's a line that crosses all geopolitical borders in the area, and it's a line that is defined as the threshold of the desert. It's an environmental line that separates arable land, that is agricultural land, from desert land. And the problem of defining that fleeting line, because as you know, that line would move up and down, north and south every year, depending on the weather condition and the climate, has been really the problem for Western cartography since the beginning of the 19th century. How to define that area? Where does the desert begin? Of course, zoologists would define it differently, agricultural experts would define it differently, people that look at urbanization and population density, people that look at animal pattern or bird pattern would define it differently. There is nothing like a clear line that is articulated until really a German-Russian scientist called Vladimir Köppen, in the moment immediately after the Orient is occupied, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, define that area as the line under which you cannot cultivate wheat. That is, you cannot cultivate a particular kind of wheat. The wheat that Vladimir Koppen experimented with was called the einkorn wheat. I suppose you understand this term here. And he was undertaking a number of experiments on it and thought that under 200 millimeter rain per year, at that threshold, it is impossible to cultivate wheat anymore. And therefore, the threshold of the desert would not be defined as a natural condition, but somehow as an entanglement of agricultural practices, the particularity of one species of plant, wheat, and the shifting conditions of rain, right? A kind of three conditions coming together to define a border that is continuously shifting. If you could see this map a bit clearer, you would see that these are effectively the map, the rain lines, the kind of the atlas. This is the Atlas of Israel that kind of show the bands of rain condition, average rain conditions. And you would see on Israel, as you would see on any other country which the threshold of the desert exists in it, that along the 200 millimeter line, a threshold of blue bands flips over to a thickening gradient of orange, right? There is a clear flipping over in the way that the law appropriates that line is to say the following logic. If you cannot cultivate wheat under 200 millimeter per rain, there cannot be a human settlement under 200 millimeter rain per year. A kind of a direct, almost linear relation between a particular cultivation of a particular species and the concept of the basis of agriculture and then architecture. You could not have settlements in any of the area that are in yellow in this map. Therefore, that area would belong to the sovereign. That area would be an area in which no property right will be possible. This would be purely a sovereign area, right? All individual rights over land are cancelled according to Israeli, but then again, the national law of many other states that inhabit that threshold of the desert. So anyone that had and lived, even if it's for hundreds of years, even if it's by cultivating other things or by having a pastoral economy, under that knife, that line from which the color shifts, is dispossessed of the property right. And it is along that 200 millimeter line that a series of demolitions, the demolition that you have seen, are taking place. That, according to our analysis now in forensic architecture, is the most violent frontier within the Middle East, although it is one that is not built. It is always also one that is continuously moving up and down, because when a threshold and a juridical threshold is defined, you start producing the realities around it. And colonial projects throughout history, we're trying always to expand the agricultural area, to push the desert southwards. When you push the desert southwards, you push also the line of private property. Now, of course, and that pushing of the desert southwards was always involved with very violent act of dispossession, as you will see. Now, desertification is pushing in the opposite direction from the trajectory of colonialism. And in between climate change pushing north, colonialism pushing south, exist a number of Bedouin communities in the area which are bearing the brunt of that violence. So this moving and shifting frontier, a frontier between cultivation and somehow the conception of untouched nature, is also a juridical line, and it is a very line that is very long in space. In fact, what it makes is an equator, a political equator that runs all around the world and is not obviously a simple line, but it kind of moves and ebbs and flows. And it is one that throughout history was moving and shifting in position. In fact, here is an attempt of the Italian colonialism in northern Libya to push south the Sahara Desert with a series of fields, with a band of fields that are now again abandoned to the Sahara as the Sahara is pushing further up north. This is a line that I've called previously the conflict shoreline. In fact, in forensic architecture, we mapped all places where drone strikes took place. It's a work that we've done for the UN. We mapped all places where American drones and Western drones are targeting different areas of conflict. And something that is rather incredible, we could see the correlation between an environmental condition, the 200-millimeter line, and drone strikes. i.e., the shifting of that line, the movement of that line that goes through northern Libya, that cuts through Gaza and the West Bank, goes into Syria, runs through the entire battlefields of the Syrian civil war, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Mali, all areas in which climate change and conflict become entangled across that conflict shoreline. Our aim, together with the village of al-Araqib, was to show that that was not correct, that the state dispossession beyond the conflict shoreline relies on a simplified science, that in fact very deep down in the desert there are traditional forms of cultivation and forms of life and forms of settlements that were simply invisible to the legislators of colonial geographies. It's not really that we have much time to go through it, but just to show you the number of studies that we were actually undertaking, both in looking through stalactite and stalagmite at the level of rains in particular part of the desert, and showing that the desert, the movement of that line, of the conflict shoreline throughout history, north and south across the desert, looking at here Bavarian Air Force, or the Bayerische Flugbataillon, photograph for the Ottoman army from the First World War, showing areas that were considered to be uninhabited and desert in those military photographs, looking not for the military things that they show, but in fact for Bedouin, for traces of Bedouin cultivation, for Bedouin existence, showing that those people were there and that the acts of demolition of the state, the act of dispossession, rely on effectively, and here when you zoom into those pictures, at the edge, always not far away from the actual fortification, you see all sorts of traces and elements of Bedouin cultivation and Bedouin life in the desert. And of course, going through even the Orientalist literature of the 19th century, walking through the land and tracing the pathway of those travelers allow us to identify old settlements there and to try and bring it as evidence. So here is a kind of a very long and very wide history of the threshold of the desert. And along it, there is always sort of a flaring of various incidents of eruptive violence, as if the long violence that has been applied on this line throughout, from the time really of the end of the First World War, from the time of Western colonialism of that area that tried to push the desert south and dispossess the Bedouins, initially the British and the French occupation of the Orient, then the Israeli and the national governments across the Arab world, and now the pushback of the desert. The desert rises back and pushes the line back north, flares up in thousands and thousands and thousands of little conflict. And our interest is really to see how those incidents themselves hold within their molecular level of those eruptive violence, that long history. One of those cases that I would like to show you in a little bit of more detail is an attack that took place in last January, of this year, where in the morning, or just before morning, really throughout the last hours of the night, a huge Israeli raid over a village that lies on another point along that line resulted in the death of 2 people. One was a Bedouin resident of that village called Yaqub Abul Kiyan, and the other an Israeli policeman. And immediately in the morning, the headlines, with their kind of deterministic weight, come up with this very misleading title: an officer murdered in a Negev terror attack. Right? The Israeli army comes, have you seen how they come, with hundreds and hundreds of soldiers into it, 2 dead, and a terror attack is being declared. In fact, in all newspapers, that is the narrative that is being proclaimed. The Israeli police now start describing exactly what has happened. Security forces, this is a tweet from the official Twitter account of the Israeli police. The security forces arrived this morning in al-Khiran. This is that village, on a law enforcement mission, i.e. their mission is to destroy that village. As they arrived, the vehicle, and this is that vehicle that they talk about, tried to accelerate and run over, and in fact ran over a policeman and killed him. This is Ayman Odeh. He's the member of parliament in Israel. He's also the head of the Joint Arab List and the head of the Communist Party, with which forensic architecture work, not only on this case but on others. He was shot in the face by an Israeli policeman with a plastic bullet in the head. This is Netanyahu's Twitter or Facebook account, and Netanyahu, our prime minister, classifies the incident as a terror attack. Erdan, the minister of internal security, this is the policeman that died, says the blood is on Odeh's hand. Right? We saw Ayman Odeh, the head of the Communist Party, on the floor with his face smashed. And the Minister of Police, in fact, accuses him of incitement. Even further, and this is like in the hours immediately after the incidents, we're following it very, very quickly. The terrorist belongs to the Islamic movement. This is, again, the Minister of Police. The head of the police is saying he's part of Daesh. I mean, they completely, within few hours, there's an incredible escalation of news until the police makes the first error. And what they do is release their own helicopter footage of it that they think show that they are correct. Now, because we are working there a lot, we are in touch with a lot of activists on the ground, with a lot of Bedouin residents and other supporters for them on the ground. And we are able to get hold of that video and to undertake a really fast analysis of what is happening in it. And this is effectively what you'll see here. I'll let it run, and then I'll explain to you. It's really important to what you will see here initially is you would see a video from an activist on the ground that has taken, turned her camera on during the time of the incident. And she's not really filming the event, but she has a camera on, and the camera records some sound. And that becomes, the sound that is recorded on her camera becomes incredibly important, because we're going to match it with the video that the police released. And by putting the sound of the activist, by matching, finding how to sync them up with the police video, we could actually start understanding a little bit more of what happened there on the ground. So here is now, it will start with the activist video from the ground. We need to start understanding what is the time that she's shooting, she's filming, etc., and you'll see the syncing working.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so what you would see that the police video is actually a thermal video. And what we could isolate is actually the flares of the gun. So you could see that policeman shooting, and we can make out the direction of the shooting. And what you see here is that the police shoot at the car well before the car accelerates. Only after it was shot, in fact, the car accelerates when the driver is unconscious and running over the police. Completely different narrative than the one that was, in fact, shown by the police or told by the police. The guy is not a terrorist. The police shoot an innocent person who loses control over his vehicle, and that is what is happening. Ayman Odeh is tweeting our analysis. The police accuses us, as they always do, of being manipulative, of being Pallywood, Palestinian Hollywood, and all sort of things like that, as they no clip that distorts evidence would change that. In fact, what we could show is that by putting sound over this image and reading the temporality of that, we can tell a very different story. Calls for the Minister of Police to resign. I'll have to go further over it, but you see the kind of the back and forth that sort of those interpretation and using social media could enter into those debates. In the parliament, still the Israeli parliament, people are accusing us of being manipulative. I'll have to skip over the rest of the investigation, but it has another 3 or 4 moments by which we are starting demolishing the police narrative step by step by step by step. And in fact, at some point, they run out of explanation. The Minister of Police has to apologize. The person, although killed, is removed from, he was treated, in fact, he was buried as a terrorist. His wife was treated as a suspect herself. They have to be, in fact, removed from that list. And then comes the line of defense that always comes whenever the police has they have no other truth to tell, has no other evidence to show. And that is the split-second argument, which we heard already in the Rodney King trial. And that is the same argument that US police would say after shooting a black motorist. In a split-second decision, we had to decide whether that action, that driving towards us, is threatening or not. The split-second decision. And it's very interesting to think about the split second, because they never say it's a half a second or 1/10 of a second. A split second is in fact the irreducible time duration in which calculation is impossible, in which only instinct is operative, in which only muscle memory is operative. And in fact, the question is how within those split second it is, why is it that an Israeli police seeing a Bedouin man driving in the desert with his car would be seen as a threat. And in fact, for us, it is that split second that holds in it the long duration of conflict within that context.
زي ما انت رفعت زي ما رفع عمر هيك ليش عمر هيك امسك الخدامه مشي معي يا امشي ايوه امشي ايوه امشي
انا خايف برمي مش استنى انا خايف على الضوء انا خايف
הם באים עם 1,700 שוטרים, עם מטוסים, מעצר מקומי, בית חולים נייד, עם כוחות, קמנדו, מטוסים באוויר, אבצ'י נחתו פה בכפר אל-עראקיב. מה אנחנו? מדינה אחרת באים ללחם? סך הכל אנחנו אזרחים. מה זאת אומרת? הכפרים האלה לא מוכרים בנגב נחתו מהשמיים? אני לא יודע. אין להם תעודת זהות? אז אני אומר כן, יש להם תעודת זהות. איפה תעודת זהות? אני אומר לכל אחד מאלה שנמצאים, אין שבט בנגב שאין לה יסוד בקרקע. ולפי דעתי, ביתי הגברות זה התעודה.
אבא שלי נולד ב-1914 באל-עראקיב, סבא שלי נולד ב-1845 ונפטר ב-1945, 100 שנה חי באל-עראקיב. הוא ביקש לקבר בבית קברות שייח' סאלח אל-עוקבי בזחליגה, כי אדמה פוריה, זה תלמי בילו היום. ופרופסור אורן יפתחאל הייתי איתו, היה איתי בזחליגה וראה עצמות המתים, עצמות הסבא שלי שהוצאנו אותם מהתעלה, שבלדוזרים חפרו שם בשדה הכביש. רבותיי, עשרות בתי קברות בנגב נמחקו מהמפה, עשרות בתי קברות של בדואים מוסלמים ערבים.
אנחנו מבקשים את הזכות שלנו, זכות הכרה מלאה באדמה שלנו. אנחנו לא מחפשים לא כסף ולא להעביר אותנו לשום מקום אחר.
السلام عليكم. أنا دكتور عواد أبو فريح، عواد جراد سويلم جراد أبو فريح الطوري من العراقيب. طبعا أنا أملك مستندات كثيرة جدا. هنا يوجد بعض من المستندات حول أرضنا في العراقيب. هذه المستندات تدل على ملكيتنا وعلى وجودنا في العراقيب منذ مئات إن لم يكن آلاف السنوات. تثبت أولا بالتوقيع الشهود وبالطوابع البريدية للدولة العثمانية وللدولة البريطانية فيما بعد. تثبت ملكيتنا لهذه الأرض، أرض العراقيب. أنا أملك في أرض العراقيب أنا وإخوتي طبعا، يعني ورثة أبوي رحمة الله عليه، ما يقارب 1200 دونم. الآن هناك نضال كبير جدا على إثبات ملكيتنا في العراقيب وإثبات ملكية وجودنا في العراقيب مع ضد دائرة أراضي إسرائيل وضد الكيرن كيامت، ما يسمى الصندوق القومي الإسرائيلي، الذين يحاولوا طبعا أن يسلبوا هذه الأرض منا. يسلبوا هذه الأرض إما عن طريق الأكاذيب بأننا بدو رحل ولم نملك أرض وكأننا يعني عابرون بالصدفة في هذه البلاد.
أنا اسمي عزيز صياح الطوري، سكان قرية العراقيب.
My name is Aziz Sayah Hattouri. I'm one of the inhabitants of al-Araqib village.
وعضو اللجنة المحلية للدفاع عن العراقيب.
And I am the one who's responsible to defend al-Araqib.
بداية أود أن أشكر كل من جيرالد، سيلفيا وماكس.
At the beginning, I would like to thank Gerald, Sylvia and Max.
أنا سعيد جدا أنني الآن أتواجد في فيينا، وكل الشكر يعود إلى أخونا وحبيبنا إيال فايتسمان والمجموعة اللي شاركتنا واستطعنا أن ننتج هذا العرض.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Vienna with you, and I would like to thank Ariel Weitzman and Ariel Kane.
قرية العراقيب هي قرية غير معترف بها.
Al-Araqib village is unrecognized village.
وهي واحدة من 46 قرية في النقب.
And it's one amongst 46 villages in Al-Naqab area.
قرية غير معترف بها تعني لا خدمات، لا يوجد ماء، لا يوجد كهرباء ولا أي خدمات.
Unrecognized village means it has no services such as electricity or water.
منذ قيام دولة إسرائيل قالت لآبائي وأجدادي: اسكنوا هذه المنطقة، لن نرحلكم، لن نهدم بيوتكم، لكن أنتم غير قانونيين.
When the Israeli state was formed, they said you can be here in this area, you can live here, but you will be never recognized.
استمرينا في العيش في قرية العراقيب، جدي، أبي وأنا.
We kept living in that area, my father, my grandfather, and me.
قرية كانت تعج بالحياة، معظم سكانها الذي يبلغ عددهم 573 شخص.
It was a village full of life, and it was formed of 573 people.
المهم في الأمر إن كل أهالي قرية العراقيب كانوا يعملون.
Everybody was working in that area.
وكنا ندفع ضرائب إلى السلطات.
And we were paying our taxes for the Israeli state.
لكن لم يوفروا لنا أي خدمات.
But they didn't serve us any services.
بجهودنا الذاتية استطعنا أن نقيم محطة كهرباء عن طريق مولدات الكهرباء.
We made our own electricity through generators.
بجهودنا الذاتية استطعنا أن نضع خزانات مياه، ومن الخزانات المياه ندخل الماء إلى البيوت.
And we could build water barrels ourselves.
كنا نعتمد في حياتنا الاقتصادية على 4 اتجاهات.
We were focusing on 4 things to live from.
الاتجاه الأول هي الزراعة التقليدية من القمح والشعير في الشتاء.
We were farming the lands.
وفي الصيف البطيخ أو الذرة.
And in summer we were living out of fruits and farming as well.
الاتجاه الثاني
Second,
كان إنتاجنا من زيت الزيتون. كنا نمتلك 4500 شجرة زيتون.
we used to have 4,500 olive trees.
كنا ننتج الزيتون ونبيعه ونصنع المخللات ونبيعها.
We were making the olive oil and sell it out.
الاتجاه الثالث
And thirdly,
منتجات الحليب. كنا نمتلك أكثر من 5 قطعان من الأغنام والماعز.
we were producing milk out of our animals.
وكنا نبيع كل منتجات الألبان في الأسواق.
And we were exporting all the dairies.
يوم الهدم
And the demolition day,
تم في 27/7/2010.
the first demolition was on the 7th of July 2010.
حيث اقتحمت قوات الظلم والخراب قرية العراقيب.
When the Israeli forces invaded our village.
تقريبا الساعة 3 صباحا.
It was about 3 in the morning.
المعاملة جدا وحشية.
They were very violent with us.
يتحدثون إلينا فقط عن طريق القوة والM16 البارودة.
And they were putting their guns in our faces.
أخرجوا الأطفال، أخرجوا النساء بالقوة من البيوت.
They forced everybody, the children and the women, to leave the houses.
وكما أخرجوا أيضا كل المتضامنين يهود وعرب وأجانب من البيوت الذين كانوا موجودين فيها.
And they forced also everybody who were helping us to leave.
وبدأوا بهدم القرية.
And they started to distract our village.
هدموا 65 بيت.
They demolished 65 houses.
هدموا حظائر الأغنام.
They destroyed also the yarns.
وحظائر البقر والخيول.
And all the houses of other animals.
وتركونا في العراء بدون مأوى.
And they left us in nowhere.
كما صادروا كل ممتلكات البيوت.
And they seized all of our assets.
أتت سيارات كبيرة، سيارات شحن، وحملوا كل ما وجدوه في القرية.
They came with big lorries and took everything we had.
وأجبرونا في أيامها أن ندفع 70,000 شيكل حتى نسترد كل أغراضنا المصادرة.
And they forced us to pay for them 700 shekels to take back our stuff.
كان الهدف الرئيسي من ترحيلنا أو من هدم العراقيب هو ترحيل الأهالي من هذه المنطقة.
Their first goal was to force us to leave the area.
الكل بيسأل ليش؟
Everybody asks why.
لكن أنا شخصيا لأني عشت في العراقيب بعرف ليش.
But me personally, since I grew up there, I know why.
لأن الحكومة في سنة 2005
Because the state in 2005
أقامت مستوطنة بجانبنا.
they were forming a civilized area in our neighborhood.
وطبيعة الحال المستوطن لا يريد جيران عرب لديه.
And the Israeli citizens, they don't want to live among Arabs.
منذ 27/7/2010
Since the 7th of July 2010
حتى 25/10/2017
until 25th of October 2017,
تم هدم القرية 120 مرة.
the village was demolished for 120 times.
تخيلوا أنا وأهلي وأبنائي نجبر أن نبني بيتنا في الشهر مرة أو مرتين.
Imagine that me and my family, we were forced to rebuild our houses for about 2 times a month.
يقولون أن القضاء مستقل في الدولة الديمقراطية.
They say it's a democratic state.
لكن في دولة إسرائيل القضاء يتبع السياسة.
But in the Israeli state, the court belongs to the policy of the state.
لأنهم يفتحون ضدنا ملفات جنائية.
Because they have courts against us.
وملفات مدنية.
And civil files also.
أنا شخصياً لي 7 ملفات جنائية.
Me personally, I have 7 files in the court.
أبي الشيخ صياح له 63 ملف جنائي.
My father was sued for 63 times.
السلطة تريد أن تحولنا إلى مجرمين.
The state wants to make us as criminals.
لكن نضالنا هو نضال سلمي وعنيد.
But we have a peaceful struggle.
لن ننجر أبداً إلى العنف.
We will not be ever been forced into violence.
سنبقى في العراقيب ونستمر في نضالنا.
We will stay in our village and we will keep struggling.
الاستنزاف القضائي.
To be in the court.
أنا شخصياً أسبوعياً معدل أسبوعياً يوم أو يومين لازم أتواجد في محكمة بئر السبع.
I have to be in front of the court twice a week.
وبطبيعة الحال عندما يفتحون ضدي ملف جنائي يجب أن أوفر محامي ليدافع عني.
And normally when I have the file in the court, I have to have a lawyer.
أنا اليوم أنا وأهلي ومجموعتي في العراقيب ندفع إلى 4 محامين.
And nowadays, me and my family, we are paying for 4 lawyers.
يمكن في منكم أحد بيعرف ميخائيل سفارد.
Maybe someone of you knows Mikhail Sfai.
On January 5th, 1945, a British Royal Air Force reconnaissance plane passed over the northern Negev as part of their aerial survey of Palestine. On that morning, flight number 13 left Port Said, took a series of nadir top-down photographs from an altitude of 15,000 feet. 5 of these images captured al-Araqib and reveal extensive Bedouin cultivation of the area. We can see stone houses. We can see cultivated fields. We can see animal pens, tents, terracing and cultivation. When looking closely, we can identify darker grains in the emulsion, marking the openings of water cisterns and wells. Significantly, what these images show clearly is that these Bedouin families were inhabiting the area way before the state of Israel was established in 1948. And more importantly, contrary to the latter claims that they were nomads and have no claim to land, we can see that they were inhabiting the land in a sedentary way. Today, these settlements are unrecognized by Israel, as you heard, and many are being demolished. There's a struggle over control of conditions of visibility. We compare the 1945 Royal Air Force image with the March 2017 GOI satellite used by Google Earth. The erasure of these villages on the ground by means of forced displacement, land works, afforestation, is mirrored by their removal from the image. These villages, home to over 100,000 people at large, these 46 villages are not recognized. While claims for these lands are still under discussion in court, a series of forests are being planted over the terrain, either erasing or covering over evidence of past Bedouin presence. There are trees, and these are trees planted in order to uproot the indigenous population under the slogan of making the desert bloom. In January 2016, Forensic Architecture, Zochrot, Public Lab, initiated a community mapping project in partnership with the residents of al-Araqib. Our photographic survey is meant to provide up-to-date, accurate aerial images of the material remains of Bedouin life in this area before it disappears. We use kites, plastic bottles, simple cameras to create what we term community satellites. Drones are used in this area by authorities to survey what is termed illegal construction, and these are followed by demolitions. So we adopt the simplest form of aerial photography possible. We choose the unobtrusive and, more importantly, the inclusive kite as our means to conduct aerial photography alongside the families. Aerial photography undertaken with community members was carried out while their feet were firmly on the ground, walking the terrain with a kite camera above. In this project, the Ground Truth Project, we are joining the already existing process of documentation and struggle started by the families themselves. At each location, we record testimony, oral, video, and measurement and geolocations. We try and record the lived meaning of this land transformation to the lived knowledge and memory, but also the possibility of a future return. The nature of violence, both in territorial and cultural historical terms, cannot be overcome simply by better visibility, though. Destruction of image and landscape takes place in three-dimensional conditions and through many disconnected constellations of data. Our mapping effort therefore aims to harness photography in its new forms to operate within these spatial conditions. We turned the aerial photographs, the aerial survey, into navigable 3D environments using a process called photogrammetry, a process that captures point clouds, photographic units that float in space in a three-dimensional way. Collect all the point clouds together using their GPS information. The result is a measurable and situated model. In the point cloud, a flat pixel is transcoded into a digital point, autonomous yet connected, time-stamped and geotagged. There is a combined sense of dry data and otherworldliness, a translucency and hyperreality in this granular realism.
كل المحاولات لطمس تضاريس ومعالم المنطقة تتم.
They tried so many times to demolish the area and to destroy all the identification of it.
بالأساس عن طريق الكيرن كيامت.
The Karen Kayemt was doing that.
يحاولون أن يمحوا آثار العربي الفلسطيني في النقب.
They tried to demolish any of our history in that area.
ويزرعون شجر الكيرن كيامت تاريخ جديد.
And they are trying to plant trees to demolish all the history of the area.
يقلعون شجرة الزيتون.
They take off the olive trees
والتين
and the figs
والعنب
and the grapes
والصبر كاكتوس.
and the cactus.
لأن هذه الأشجار تدل على العربي الفلسطيني في النقب.
Because these trees are part of our identity.
وكما رأيتم أن هنالك أكوام من الحجارة داخل الغابات الذين زرعوها هناك.
And as you see, there were piles of stones in the forest they were trying to plant.
هذه كانت بيوت لابن عمي وجاري في قرية العراقيب.
These were the houses of my cousin and neighbor in al-Araqib.
اليوم ترى وكأنها كومة زبالة هناك.
Today you see it as a pile of garbage in that area.
وهو الأمر بالنسبة لآبار المية.
And it's the same about the water barrels.
هنالك العشرات من آبار الماء في المنطقة التي زرعت بالكيرن كيامت.
There were plants of this area. They were planted by the Karen Kayemt.
ومع الوقت ومع مرور الوقت
And with the time,
صاحب الأرض الأصلي الذي هجر من هذه الأرض
the owner of this land that have been expelled out of this land,
عندما يأتي لزيارة أرضه لا يستطيع
when he comes to visit his land, he cannot recognize it anymore.
أن تعرف عليها. وبهذه الطريقة وفي أنحاء العالم
And in the international world,
الكيرن كيامت تقول أنا أود أن أزرع الصحراء بالشجر.
And in front of the international world, the Keren Kiyam, the Jewish International Fund, they are trying to tell the world that they are trying to plant the desert.
لكن كيف يقطعون شجرتي التي عمرها 50 و60 و40 و30 سنة؟
But actually they have took off of the land our trees that they are 50 years old.
ويزرعون شجرة عمرها يوم واحد.
And they plant a tree that is one day.
كل إنسان حر عاقل
Every free single person
لا يرضى بهذه المعادلة.
He cannot accept this.
الكيرن كيامت هو العدو الأساس للنقب وأهله.
The Keren Kiyam is our first enemy.
لأنهم يريدون محي آثاري وآثار كل بدوي في النقب.
Because they want to demolish any of our identity.
لكننا نربي أبناءنا جيل بعد جيل.
But we are raising our children.
ونعلمهم أن هذه الأرض تتبع لكم.
And we teach them that this land belongs to you.
كل العالم في هذا اليوم في هذا الفترة
Everybody nowadays
يعاني من الهجرة.
they are suffering from migration.
إلى أين يريدون أن يهجروننا نحن من أرضنا؟
To where they want us to go.
هل أنتم مستعدون أن تستقبلوا البدو في أرضكم؟
Are you able to have us in your lands?
غير معقول. أنا سأستمر في نضالي.
That's not acceptable. I will keep struggling.
حتى الاعتراف بقرية العراقيب.
Until al-Araqib is being recognized.
This is a collectively produced image that brings together photographs from multiple people across multiple sources and multiple times. In January, we photographed the Aturi cemetery. In May, we photographed the structures south to the cemetery belonging to the Aturi family. In November 2016, in the autumn, the remnants that are otherwise covered by a layer of plants. In December 2016, we mapped the Abu Frech wells north of the Aturi cemetery. The Abu Frech is another family living in the area. And in March, the terrain and houses related to the Abu Siam family. In this first beta iteration of the Negev platform, the residents of al-Araqib, Forensic Architecture, Zochrot, Public Lab, wish to form an infrastructure that brings together existing archives, our civic-led survey, and situated testimony. For this, we've been working to create a GIS mapping platform which operates in a three-dimensional environment. An archive of thousands of images taken from before the first demolition and until now, from 2010 until these very days, collected from residents, cell phone data, from activists working, mainly from active stills. These images give us a glimpse into the processes of destruction and rebuilding. GPS information from the file's metadata is automatically used to position each image, each individual photograph and video on the point cloud terrain. Each site that we survey is entered into the platform along with both official Israeli information and data and testimony given by the families that were evicted from these locations. From the Aturi cemetery, from the al-Uqbi cemetery, all these places that are being slowly, gradually eroded and vanishing This is the al-Araqib cemetery, mainly of children, that has been fenced off, and around it, slowly the new forest is starting to cover. Sometimes we map individual wells, but haven't surveyed the area around them. So you have these islands of wells floating in the middle of nothingness over the map, but this is a demolition from 2014, an example.
تراكتور زبوني تمدينة والله كل كاتب تمدينة حوال عليه وشارتي مشوم دفرت توب تمدينة.
The images and videos are placed in the platform according to their geolocation, either the one that's embedded in, or if it doesn't have geolocation in it, in the file itself, we place it manually alongside the residents who took the photographs. And we have thousands and thousands of these images and videos and land documents, audio files, both of memory and of straightforward documentation that's been conducted by the residents themselves and the activists on a weekly basis. This is an image from 2009, from before the demolition.
بدأ المشروع بالتوثيق لأن التوثيق مهم جدا.
This project started to document as documentation is very important.
عملنا واشتغلنا أنا وفايتسمان وأرييل والأطفال لمدة 4 سنين.
I worked hard with Weizmann and Ariel for 4 years and the children.
لأنكم كما ترون بكل الوسائل والطرق يريدون تغيير تضاريس هذه الأرض.
Because as you see, they are trying with all the strength they got to change the identity of this land.
في العراقيب عملنا سوية أطفال نساء مجموعة إيال وأنا.
In al-Araqib we work together, women, children, the Ariel group.
لأن اليوم السلطات تطالبنا بوثائق سنة 1880.
Because nowadays the states are wanting from us documents that belongs to the 1982.
تعلمنا من الماضي ونحن نتجه إلى المستقبل.
We have learned from history and we are looking forward.
وكان المشروع جدا جدا ناجح وكل الأهالي والأطفال شاركوا في هذا المشروع.
The project was very successful and all of us was working on that.
شعور الأطفال، شعور النساء.
The feeling of the children and of the women.
عندما تأتي مجموعات ونتواصل مع مجموعات.
When we are in contact with these groups that are working on these projects.
هذا بالنسبة لنا ثمرة لنضالنا.
For us this is the fruits of our struggle.
ويعطينا الدفع والأمل في الاستمرار.
And it gives us hope to keep struggling.
لأننا نتواصل مع كل حر وشريف على وجه الأرض.
Because we are in contact with the free and civilized people on earth.
تخيلوا الآن أنا موجود هنا في فيينا وأهلي في العراقيب.
Imagine now that I am now in this moment in Vienna and all of my family is still in Araqib.
أنا فخور بهم وهم فخورون بي.
I am very proud of them and they are very proud of me.
وهذه العروض والمؤتمرات التي تدار حول قضية العراقيب
And all these projects and lectures are about our village.
تعطينا دفعة معنوية.
It gives us hope.
حتى الاعتراف بقرية العراقيب.
Until our village is being recognized.
سنستمر في نضالنا.
We will keep on our struggle.
حتى الاعتراف.
Until we are recognized.
أبداً لن نتنازل.
We will never surrender.
ولن نبيع هذه الأرض.
And we will not sell our lands.
لأن هذه الأرض هي أمنا.
Because this land is our mother.
هناك تربينا.
We grew up there.
وهنالك عشنا.
We lived there.
هنالك تزوجنا وأنجبنا أطفال.
We got married and had our children there.
إذا الحكومة بتفكر إن القوة هي الحل.
If the state is thinking that the force is the solution.
هذا أكبر غلط.
This is the biggest mistake.
الحل بالتفاهم بالتراضي.
The solution is with peace.
في سنة 1948
In the 1948
كان جدي الوحيد الذي يتحدث بشأن الأرض.
My grandfather was the only one who was talking about this land.
وهو جيل جدي.
And the generation of my grandfather.
الآن في سنة 2017
Now in 2017
3 أجيال نستمر في النضال.
We are now 3 generations keep on struggling.
وهم
And they are
أبي
my father,
وأنا
me,
وابني.
and my son.
ابني يحمل حلم.
My son has a dream.
يحمل أنه يكمل دراسته ويدخل الجامعات.
He dreams to continue his school and goes to the university.
وهو ينوي أن يتعلم الطب.
And he wants to study medicine.
وحلمه أن يفتح العيادة الأولى في قرية العراقيب.
And he dreams to have his first praxis in this village.
تخيلوا شاب عمره 13 سنة.
Imagine that a 13 years old boy
حلمه سيتحقق بعد 20 سنة.
That his dream will come true in 20 years.
رغم الظروف المعيشية التي يعيشها.
Despite all these circumstances.
رغم الهدم والدمار والتخريب.
Despite the destruction.
لكنه يحمل الأمل.
He still has the hope.
في نفسه حتى يعترفوا بقرية العراقيب.
Until our village is being recognized.
بمثل العالم الحر وبدعمكم المعنوي سنستمر في النضال السلمي.
Through your standing here with us and with you and with your hope, we will keep on struggling.
حتى الاعتراف بقرية العراقيب.
Until we are recognized.
أبدا نحن نوعدكم ونوعد كل حر وشريف.
We promise everyone.
لن أبيع أرض العراقيب ما زلت على قيد الحياة.
I will not sell my land as long as I am living.
شكرا لكم وشكرا لإيال وشكرا لكل من ساهم.
Thanks for everybody that was here.